This story isn't in any history book. It can't be. There's no archive that holds it, no county clerk who logged it, no newspaper that ran it above the fold. And that's the first thing you need to know before we begin, because the silence is the whole point. We are not going to pretend this happened. We are going to do something stranger. We are going to build the version of 1925 where it did, walk through it stone by stone, and then ask the only question that actually matters. Why does a story with no evidence feel more honest than the textbook sitting on your shelf? So come back with me. Late August, 1925. The Hudson Valley, somewhere north of the city, where the river goes quiet and the hills fold over each other like sleeping animals. In the version of the past we're about to build, that summer was the driest anyone could remember. No rain since May. The corn stood brown in the fields. The wells were giving up mud. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And the reservoir that fed 3 towns had dropped so far that the old waterline sat 20 feet above the surface, like a bathtub ring on the rock. People walked down to look at it the way you'd walk down to look at a fire. There was something almost rude about seeing that much of the riverbed naked in the sun. Tree stumps that had been drowned for decades stood up black and dripping. An old rowboat surfaced, full of silt. A child found a horseshoe and a pocket watch within 10 feet of each other. The valley was giving up its secrets, one boot-sucking step at a time. And for a few weeks that summer, nobody thought twice about it. Droughts reveal things. That's just what they do. But then, a man named, let's call him Walter, because in this telling he needs a name, walked out onto the exposed flat below the dam to count his losses. He had grazing rights on that bottomland in dry years, and he was checking whether the grass had any life left in it. And about 300 yards out, where the water had never once pulled back in living memory, his boot hit something that did not give. He thought it was a rock at first. Everybody's first thought is a rock. He scraped the mud away with his heel, expecting granite. What came up under his boot was white. Not white like bone, white like a kitchen counter. White like something that had been polished by a hand that wanted it to shine. He got down on his knees and pushed the mud away with both arms. And the more he cleared, the less sense it made, because it wasn't a stone, it was a surface, flat, level, cut so true that water beaded on it instead of soaking in. And running through the white were veins of grey and gold, the way they run through marble in a bank lobby or a cathedral. Walter had laid plenty of foundations in his life. He knew what poured stone looked like, what fieldstone looked like, what the old Dutch settlers had managed with the tools they had. This was none of that. This was finished. And here is where you have to slow down and feel it the way he felt it, because the legend lives or dies on this moment. He wasn't looking at a chunk of something. He was looking at a flaw. It went on. He cleared a patch the size of a dinner table, then a patch the size of a wagon, and the edges never came. No seam where a builder would have stopped. No crack where frost would have split it. Just a vast, level, polished plain, sitting under the mud of a valley that, as far as anyone had ever been told, had only ever held trees and water and the occasional drowned rowboat. Walter did what any of us would do. He went and got people. By evening there were maybe a dozen men out on the flat with lanterns and shovels, and by the next morning the dozen had become 50, and the 50 had cleared enough to see that the floor had a pattern. Tiles, some said. A repeating shape worked into the stone, too regular to be natural, too large to be a fluke. One man swore there was an inlay of a darker stone running in a long straight line toward the centre of the reservoir, like a path, like the whole thing was pointing at something still under water. Word of it travelled the way these things did before telephones reached every farm, by horse and by mouth, and by the second evening the flat below the dam had the feeling of a county fair held in a graveyard. Somebody strung lanterns on poles. Somebody else brought a fiddle, then put it away, because it didn't feel right out there. The men who'd cleared the most stood in a loose circle around the bare patch of floor and argued in low voices about what to do, and the children who'd come along did what children do, which was lie flat on the cold stone and press their faces to it to feel how smooth it was. One of them, an old woman telling it 60 years later, said you could feel a faint warmth coming up through the marble even after the sun went down. She said it was the only part she never told anyone because it was the only part that frightened her. They took a rubbing of the pattern, the way you'd take a rubbing of a gravestone, paper and charcoal pressed flat. And in the legend, that rubbing is the one piece of physical proof that supposedly survived, passed hand to hand for decades, photographed badly, lost in a house fire, described always by someone who heard it from someone else. The pattern, they say, was a repeating 8-pointed shape, the same star you find worked into the floors of old churches and the walls of old forts, the shape the believers insist is a signature, a maker's mark left by the same hands everywhere on earth. And the dark line of inlay ran straight as a rifle shot toward the deepest part of the reservoir, toward whatever the drought had not been cruel enough to uncover. An old surveyor in the crowd, a man who'd laid out half the roads in the county, got down with his level and his chain and checked the floor against true. And the story says he stood up white in the face, because the floor wasn't just flat. It was flatter than his instruments. It was level to a tolerance he had no tools to even measure, sitting at the bottom of a wild valley, under a river, in a country that wasn't supposed to be able to cut stone like that for another lifetime, or maybe had never been able to at all. That's the part of the story that always gets retold. The line that points, the path under the water. The idea that what they found was only the doorstep of something much bigger, and that the drought had only pulled the curtain back far enough to tease. Now, if this were a normal find, you know exactly what would have happened next. A professor from a city college would have come up on the train with a notebook and a camera. The local paper would have run a breathless headline about a lost settlement. Someone would have pried up a tile to sell, and someone else would have started charging admission. That's how the 1920s handled a marvel. Loudly, and for money. In this version of the story, none of that happened. Because on the third day, before the professor or the reporter or the souvenir hunter could arrive, something else came up the valley road first. Trucks. Government trucks. The kind nobody in that county had ever had reason to see. And the men who got out of them were not from any college. They wore plain work clothes with no insignia, which is a detail the storytellers love, because a uniform you can trace, and a plain shirt you cannot. They had surveying equipment and pumps, and a quiet, practiced way of moving that told everyone watching this was not the first floor these men had been called to look at. They did not seem surprised. They did not seem curious. They seemed, more than anything, like men arriving to clean up a spill. The way the legend tells it, they were federal engineers, and they were polite, and they were absolutely immovable. They thanked the locals for their interest. They explained, in the calm voice of a man who has explained it before, that the structure was unstable, that the exposed stone could shift and collapse the dam, that for everyone's safety the site had to be sealed before the rains returned. And then they did something that nobody in the valley could quite square with the explanation they'd just been given. They didn't study it. They didn't measure the pattern or sketch the line or pull a single tile for examination. They buried it. They brought in clay by the truckload. Not the local soil, which was thin and sandy, but heavy grey clay hauled from somewhere else, the kind that packs down hard and lets nothing through. They graded it over the floor in a single long afternoon, tamped it flat, and seeded it. And here is the detail that turns a curiosity into a legend that won't die. They reopened the upstream gates. They let the reservoir fill back in early, weeks ahead of any rain, drowning the whole flat under 20 feet of dark water before a single photograph could be developed and shown around. By the time the drought broke in October, there was nothing to see. There never had been, if you asked the right people. The men in plain clothes were gone, the trucks were gone. And the floor, the white floor with the gold veins and the line that pointed somewhere, was under more water than it had ever held, sealed beneath a lid of imported clay, in a valley that went right back to growing corn, as if it had dreamed the whole thing. Now we step out of the story for a second, because you and I both know what this is. This is the shape of 1,000 tales that live on certain corners of the internet, the corners where people are convinced that the world we were handed is a forgery. They have a name for the imagined empire that supposedly built these impossible floors and flawless arches. They call it Tartaria, and the appeal of it is not really about marble at all. We'll get to what it's actually about, but first let's be fair to the believers and lay out the case they'd make, because a story this stubborn is worth understanding before you dismiss it. The argument goes like this. Look around at the old buildings, the believers say. The courthouses and train stations and World's Fair pavilions from 150 years ago. Look at the hand-carved stone, the domes, the ornament worked into every cornice and column. Then look at what we build now. Boxes. Glass and steel boxes that go up in a year and look like they were designed by an accountant, because they were. The believer holds those two things side by side and asks a question that, honestly, has a little hook in it. How did a country with horses and hand tools build cathedrals, and a country with cranes and computers builds parking garages? And then they go further. They point at the photographs of those World's Fairs, the white cities that rose in Chicago and Buffalo and St. Louis, acres of palaces in gleaming white, and they note, correctly, that almost all of it was torn down within a year or two, demolished, erased. Why, they ask, would anyone build something that beautiful only to knock it flat, unless the building was never built at all, unless it was found, inherited, left behind by someone older, and quietly disassembled so the rest of us would never start asking who? And once you start seeing it, the believers say, you can't stop. Look at the star forts, they tell you, those perfect geometric stars of stone that ring old harbours from Italy to the tip of South America, all built to the same impossible pattern, all attributed to engineers who supposedly never compared notes. Look at the buildings with windows half sunk below the modern sidewalk. Whole first floors buried as if a tide of mud rolled through the cities of the world, and the survivors simply paved over it and kept walking. They call those the mud floods, a great forgotten catastrophe scrubbed from the record, and they'll show you 100 photographs of arched windows peeking up out of the dirt as proof that the ground floor we walk on today was the second floor of somebody else's world. Look at the asylums, they say, those vast ornate palaces built in the late 1800s to house the mad, grander than any building a governor ever worked in, far too beautiful and far too enormous to have been built for the purpose we were told. Look at the orphans, the trains full of children shipped across the country in those same years, a whole generation of kids with no past, no parents, no memory, handed new names and new histories. What if, the believer whispers, the orphans weren't orphans? What if they were the survivors? What if some great reset wiped the world clean, and the children were all that was left, and the empty palaces were repurposed as asylums and almshouses to quietly hold the ones who remembered too much? It's an architecture of suspicion, and it is genuinely, almost beautifully total. Every grand old building becomes a relic of the lost world. Every demolition becomes a cover-up. Every gap in the record becomes a redaction, and the marble floor under the Hudson Valley reservoir fits into it like a key into a lock that was carved to receive it. That's the engine under the marble floor. Walter's discovery isn't really a discovery in the believer's mind. It's a seam in the cover story, a place where the older world pokes up through the patch job, and the men in plain clothes aren't engineers protecting a dam. They're the clean-up crew for history itself. The people whose whole job is to make sure the floor goes back under the water before you get a good look. It's a hell of a story. I want to be honest with you about why, because the why is more interesting than the floor. The believers are pointing at something real, and that's what gives the whole thing its grip. We did build astonishing things by hand. The stonework on a 100-year-old bank really is better than the stonework on a new one, because labour was cheap and skilled and patient in a way it simply isn't now. The World's Fairs really were torn down, acres of them, almost as soon as they opened. All of that is true, and it's stranger and a little sadder than most people ever stop to think about. The believer has correctly noticed that something precious was lost. They've just reached for the wrong reason. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Because the real reason we tore down the White City is almost too plain to make a video about. Those palaces weren't marble at all. They were a plaster and burlap mix, sprayed over wood frames, a temporary material designed to photograph like stone and last exactly one season. They were stage sets. Beautiful, enormous, deliberately disposable stage sets, and everyone at the time knew it, and the contracts to demolish them were signed before the gates ever opened. There was no empire to hide. There was a budget and an insurance policy and a fire that took most of what was left anyway, and the hand-carved courthouse that puts the new one to shame. It shames the new one because a stonemason in 1890 earned in a week what you'd now pay him in an hour, if you could even find him, and there were thousands of him, trained from boyhood, working for wages that built ornament into everything. We didn't lose the knowledge. We lost the cheap labour, and we are not, if we're honest, in any hurry to bring back the conditions that produced it. The cathedral isn't evidence of a vanished super-civilization. It's evidence of a very present one that decided ornament wasn't worth what it cost. That's a less thrilling answer. It's also the true one, and it asks something harder of us than a conspiracy ever could. And the rest of the catalogue comes apart the same gentle way, if you let it. The star forts aren't a lost technology. They're the very logical answer to a very specific problem, which was the cannon. Round medieval walls shattered under artillery. So Renaissance engineers learned to build low-angled points that deflected a cannonball and left no blind spot for an attacker to hide in, and that geometry, worked out and printed in textbooks and taught across Europe for 3 centuries, is why a fort in Italy and a fort in Cartagena look like cousins. They were following the same math, not the same ghost. The buried first floors are real, and they're one of my favourite true stories because the truth is more impressive than the myth. Cities like Seattle and Chicago genuinely raise their own streets by a full story in places, jacking up entire blocks with armies of men and screwjacks to fix drainage and sewage in towns built too low and too flat. People kept doing business while the sidewalks climbed past their windows. There was no mud flood. There was a city that decided to lift itself up out of its own filth, and it left those sunken ground floors behind as a monument to one of the least glamorous and most heroic public works projects in the history of plumbing. The asylums were enormous, because a reformer named Kirkbride convinced a whole era that fresh air, sunlight, and long, elegant wings full of windows could heal a troubled mind, and states competed to build the grandest cure they could afford. The orphan trains were real, and they are heartbreaking, but they carried the children of immigrants and the urban poor west to farm families, a well-meaning and often cruel social experiment, not the amnesiac survivors of a vanished age. Every single thread, when you pull it, leads not to an empire, but to people. Ordinary, ambitious, frightened, brilliant people, doing the best and the worst they could with the century they were handed. So why does the marble floor still win? Why, when you lay the real explanation right next to the legend, does the legend feel heavier in your hand? Here's where I think it actually comes from, and it has nothing to do with Tartaria and everything to do with you. We are living through the first era in human history where the official story is delivered to us in total, glossy, seamless confidence, and almost none of us trust it. You've been lied to by institutions enough times that the lie has become the expected texture of the world. You've watched experts be wrong with perfect posture. You've watched the record get quietly edited. And so when someone shows you a white floor under the mud and a crew of nameless men who buried it before you could look, some deep part of you doesn't think conspiracy. It thinks recognition. It thinks, yes, that is what it feels like to live here. And the storytellers know it, even if they couldn't tell you they know it. Notice how the legend is built. The find is always made by an ordinary man, a farmer, a fisherman, a kid skipping stones. Never a scientist, never an official, because the whole point is that the truth surfaces from below, from the people, in the one unguarded moment when the water drops and the authorities aren't looking. And the cover-up is always fast. Hours, not weeks. The men in plain clothes are always already on their way, as if they were waiting, as if there is a standing crew whose entire purpose is to sit by a telephone and wait for the next floor to surface. The speed is the message. It tells you the secret is so important that an entire silent apparatus exists to protect it, and that you, ordinary you, got within one boot scrape of the thing they fear most. That is an intoxicating thing to be told. It takes the smallness most of us feel, the sense of being a passenger in a world run by people who don't explain themselves, and it flips it into significance. You're not powerless. You're dangerous. You're the one who might find the flaw. No wonder it spreads. It isn't really a theory about the past. It's a promise about your own importance, and it costs nothing to believe, and it asks nothing of you except that you keep your eyes on the water. The marble floor is not a claim about 1925. It's a feeling about now, wearing a period costume. And the men in plain clothes who arrive before the professor, who don't study the wonder but smother it, who reopen the gates and let the water take it back before the photograph can dry, they aren't engineers. They're every time you sensed that the answer you were given was the answer that was convenient, and you had no way to prove it, and you had to go back to growing corn as if you'd dreamed the whole thing. That's the real haunting at the bottom of the reservoir. Not a lost empire, a lost certainty. The believer and the skeptic are actually grieving the same thing. One of them just decided the grief needed a villain, and a villain is so much easier to live with than the truth, which is that nobody is hiding the flaw, and that's almost worse, because it means the dullness of the world is not a cover story. It's just the world. But let's go back under the water one last time, because the story isn't quite finished, and the ending is the part that should stay with you. In the legend, the valley never forgot. The men in plain clothes left, and the corn came back, and the reservoir sat there dark and ordinary for the rest of the century. But every few decades, when a dry summer pulled the water down far enough, somebody would walk out onto the mud, flat below the dam, and feel their boot hit something that didn't give. And they'd scrape away the clay, the heavy grey imported clay that was never supposed to be there, and underneath it they'd find white. And they'd get that same cold feeling Walter got, the feeling of standing on a floor that someone went to enormous trouble to make sure you would never see. And every time the story goes, the trucks came back, a little faster each time, a little quieter. Until the locals learned to stop reporting it, learned that the surest way to make the water rise early was to pick up a telephone, and the floor passed into the kind of knowledge that gets handed down at kitchen tables and never written down, because writing it down is how they find out, you know. There's a version that puts the last sighting in a dry autumn in the 60s, when the reservoir dropped again and two teenagers out spotlighting for fish supposedly walked their boat right over a pale shape under the surface, wide and flat and wrong, and watched their flashlight beam slide across it without catching a single edge. They told one adult, the way the story always goes, and the adult told them to never tell anyone else, not because he didn't believe them, but because he did. He'd been a boy in 1925. He remembered the trucks. He remembered how fast the water came back up. And he had spent 40 years not saying the word marble out loud, and he wanted those two kids to learn the same silence before it cost them anything, because in the world the legend builds, knowing is the only crime, and the floor is the only evidence, and the water is always, always rising to take it back. That's the genius of the legend, by the way, and it's worth naming. It's built so that the absence of evidence is the evidence. No photographs? They confiscated them. No records? They sealed them. No floor when you go and look? Of course not. The water's up. That's the whole point. You cannot disprove it, because disproof was designed into it from the start. It's a perfect machine for surviving contact with reality, and that's exactly why you should be a little careful with it, and a little tender toward the people caught inside it. A belief that can't be wrong isn't strong. It's just sealed. Same as the floor. And the people inside it, I want to be careful here, are not fools. That is the thing the debunkers always get wrong, the smug ones, the ones who think a fact is the same as a cure. The person who believes in the marble floor is usually someone who looked hard at the world and noticed correctly that a lot of it doesn't add up. They notice that the powerful do in fact hide things, that records do in fact get sealed, that experts do in fact close ranks and protect their own. They got all of that right. They just took a true observation and built a false cathedral on top of it, because the false cathedral is warm, and the truth, the real truth about cheap labour and disposable plaster and cities that lifted their own streets, is cold and complicated and doesn't hand you a single villain to point at. You don't argue someone out of a warm room by describing the cold one more accurately. You argue them out by sitting down in the warm room with them first and admitting it's nicer in here, and then asking, gently, whether nice and true are the same thing. So what do we do with a story like this, you and I, standing here at the edge of a reservoir that was never real, looking at a floor that was never poured? I think we let it be what it actually is. A beautiful, eerie, deeply human piece of folklore, born in our own anxious decade, dressed up in the clothes of 1925, because the past gives our suspicions somewhere safe to stand. I think we admire the craftsmanship of it the way Walter admired the craftsmanship of that floor, with real wonder and a clear head about what it is and isn't. And I think we ask the harder question the legend is too frightened to ask, not who buried the marble, but why a world this strange and this lonely makes a buried marble floor feel like coming home. Because the believers got one thing exactly right, and I'll give it to them, sincerely, before we go. Something was here before us that we'll never fully see, something enormous and patient and astonishingly skilled. It wasn't an empire called Tartaria. It was just everyone who came before, the masons and the engineers and the men who poured the real foundations under the real towns, working in conditions we'd never accept, for wages we'd never pay, leaving behind more than we'll ever match and less than we'll ever understand. They are under our feet right now, all of them, in the literal foundations of every place we live. We walk on their floors every single day. We just call it the ground. Go to any old city and walk into the lobby of a bank built in 1910 and put your hand flat on the marble. Real marble this time, no legend required. Feel how cold it is, how heavy, how some quarryman cut it out of a mountain and some teamster hauled it and some mason set it level by hand and lamplight, and not one of them signed it, and not one of them is remembered, and the floor outlived all of them, and will outlive you. That is the actual lost civilization. It isn't lost because someone buried it. It's lost the way every yesterday is lost, by being so completely woven into the floor beneath your feet that you stopped being able to see it at all. The drought never had to expose anything. The marble was always right there in the lobby, holding up the present, waiting for someone to kneel down and feel the warmth still coming up through the stone. The drought of 1925 never exposed a marble floor. There was no crew in plain clothes, no imported clay, no gates reopened early to drown a secret. I told you that at the start, and I'll tell you again at the end, because the honesty is the gift. But the next time you stand on something old and finished, and better than it had any right to be, and you feel that cold thrill run up through your boots, the one that whispers that the world is hiding something from you, listen to it carefully. It isn't lying to you. It's just confused about the address. The thing you're grieving isn't buried in a reservoir in the Hudson Valley. It's everywhere. We're standing on it. And no one had to seal it away, because the most astonishing trick the past ever pulled was holding still long enough to let us forget it was there at all. That's the floor. That's the whole of it. A drought that didn't happen, a marble that was never laid, and a feeling so real it built an empire to explain itself. Hold the feeling. Question the empire. And the next dry summer, when the water goes down and your boot hits something that doesn't give, kneel down, clear the mud, and look. It won't be marble. It'll be better. It'll be true.